A woman standing on the edge of blessing often feels like she is losing parts of herself before she ever sees what she is gaining. The transformation begins quietly in places no one applauds. She starts to outgrow conversations that once felt natural, and the shift can feel unsettling because growth rarely announces itself as comfort. It feels like grief mixed with clarity. She notices that certain habits no longer fit her spirit, and trying to return to them feels like wearing clothes that shrank overnight. This internal separation is not about superiority. It is about alignment. Something inside her is being recalibrated. Her tolerance for chaos decreases while her desire for peace intensifies. She becomes more protective of her energy, more selective with her time, not because she loves people less, but because she is learning to love her purpose more. At the same time, the battles around her seem to multiply. Small inconveniences feel loaded with meaning. Misunderstandings appear in relationships that used to be simple. Doors close without explanation. It would be easy to interpret this as failure, but the pressure is revealing muscles she didn't know she had. Each challenge forces her to reach deeper into faith instead of relying on old coping mechanisms. She learns to pause before reacting, to pray before panicking, to breathe before assuming the worst. These moments stretch her emotional and spiritual endurance. The fight is not random. It is targeted training. Strength is being formed in repetition, in choosing trust again and again when disappointment would be easier. The woman she is becoming is more grounded, less shaken by external storms, because she is discovering an anchor that circumstances cannot rip away. Old wounds begin to resurface during this transformation, and that can be the most confusing part. Just when she believes she has moved forward, memories return with sharp detail. Past betrayals, insecurities, and fears step back into the light. It feels unfair, as if healing is moving backward. In truth, the pain is being invited up so it can finally be resolved instead of managed. She starts recognizing patterns she once ignored. She sees how unhealed places influenced her choices, how silence protected others but harmed her. This awareness is tender work. There are nights filled with tears she cannot fully explain, but each tear is washing something clean. She is learning to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. In that honesty, compassion for herself is born. She stops blaming her sensitivity and starts honoring it as a signal that her heart is still alive and capable of restoration. Discipline grows alongside this healing, not as rigid control, but as intentional stewardship. She becomes aware that her time, thoughts, and energy are resources. She begins structuring her days with purpose, even in small ways, waking a little earlier to gather her thoughts, setting boundaries she once avoided, choosing nourishment over distraction. These choices look ordinary from the outside, but inside they are revolutionary. Each act of discipline is a vote for the future she believes is coming. She is proving to herself that she can be trusted with more by caring well for what she already has. Consistency becomes her quiet declaration of faith. She is no longer waiting passively. She is preparing actively. Throughout this transformation, there is a subtle loneliness that accompanies growth. Not everyone understands the changes happening within her. Some people prefer the version of her that was easier to predict, easier to access, easier to influence. As she evolves, she may feel misunderstood or accused of becoming distant. The temptation to shrink back is real. Yet every time she chooses authenticity over approval, her roots grow deeper. She learns that transformation sometimes requires walking without constant validation. The solitude becomes sacred space where her identity is clarified. She discovers who she is when no one is defining her, and that discovery is a gift disguised as isolation. Increased resistance has a way of making a woman question her direction, especially when she expected progress to feel smoother. Instead, the road grows steeper right when she thought she was gaining momentum. She prays for clarity and meets confusion. She asks for peace and encounters pressure. Yet this friction is not evidence that she is off course. It is often proof that she is moving into territory that requires a stronger version of her. Resistance exposes weak spots in her confidence, not to shame her, but to strengthen her awareness. Every obstacle becomes a mirror, showing her where fear still whispers and where courage must answer. She begins to realize that difficulty is not automatically denial. Sometimes it is an invitation to rise. Discomfort becomes her unexpected teacher. She can no longer rely on old definitions of security. Situations force her out of familiar routines and into spaces where she must think, decide, and trust differently. This stretching feels awkward, like learning to walk with longer strides than she is used to. There are moments she wants to retreat to what is predictable, even if it was limiting. But something inside her recognizes that comfort was never meant to be her permanent address. The unease sharpens her awareness. She starts listening more closely to her inner convictions instead of external noise. In the tension, her discernment matures. She learns to distinguish between fear that warns and fear that lies. That clarity is forged in discomfort, not in ease. Emotional stretching accompanies this growth, and it can feel overwhelming because it touches areas she carefully guarded. Situations arise that trigger old insecurities, and her first instinct is to defend herself the way she always has. But now there is a pause between impulse and reaction. In that pause, she sees her options. She can repeat the pattern, or she can respond from the woman she is becoming. Each time she chooses the latter, even imperfectly, she rewires her emotional reflexes. Strength is forming not in grand gestures, but in these quiet decisions. She is training her heart to remain open under pressure instead of closing for protection. That openness is risky, but it is also where resilience is born. As resistance increases, so does her awareness of her own capacity. She starts doing things she once believed were beyond her, handling conversations she used to avoid, making decisions without endless reassurance, standing in rooms that intimidate her and realizing she still belongs there. The challenges that once would have paralyzed her now activate her. She may still feel fear, but fear no longer dictates her direction. It becomes background noise rather than a steering wheel. This shift is subtle but profound. She is learning that bravery is not the absence of trembling. It is movement in spite of it. Each step forward expands her internal map of what is possible. The pressure also refines her priorities. Under strain, superficial concerns lose their grip. She becomes less interested in proving herself and more invested in becoming herself. Approval that once felt essential starts to feel optional. She measures success less by applause and more by alignment. This recalibration gives her a steadier center. When external opinions fluctuate, she is not thrown as far off. Balance. The resistance that threatened to scatter her is actually concentrating her focus. She becomes anchored in values rather than outcomes. Through all of this, resilience is quietly assembling inside her. Not the loud resilience that announces victory, but the steady kind that survives uncertainty. She develops endurance for unanswered questions. She learns Waiting no longer feels like wasted time, but like active strengthening. Her patience gains muscle. She stops interpreting delay as abandonment and starts seeing it as construction. The woman emerging from this season is not simply tougher. She is wiser about her own depth. She understands that expansion is rarely gentle, but it is purposeful, and every ounce of pressure she survives becomes evidence that she can carry more than she once imagined, that her limits were never as fixed as they appeared, and that the very resistance she feared is shaping a resilience that will outlast the moment that created it. Persistent hope is one of the quietest yet strongest signals that transformation is underway, because it survives in conditions that should have extinguished it. A woman approaching blessing often carries a strange mixture of exhaustion and expectation. She knows what it feels like to be disappointed, yet she cannot fully surrender her belief that something greater is forming. This hope is not loud optimism or denial of reality. She still sees the bills, the setbacks, the unanswered messages, the closed doors. But beneath all of it runs a current of certainty she cannot logically defend. It is as if her spirit has seen a preview her eyes have not caught up to yet. That inner knowing steadies her when circumstances wobble. She may cry, she may question, but she does not collapse in the same way anymore. Hope becomes her spine, holding her upright when everything external leans. They awakened from the baby of the baby. Everything external lean. Instead of becoming bitter from her struggles, she becomes more attentive to the struggles of others. Pain has tuned her hearing. She notices the tremor in someone's voice, the forced smile, the silence that signals overwhelm. Where she once rushed past people, she now pauses. Her empathy is no longer theoretical. It is informed by survival. She understands what it means to carry invisible weight, so she handles others gently. This softness is not weakness. It is evidence of strength that did not harden. Many people protect themselves by closing off after hurt, but she is being shaped differently. Her heart is stretching, making room not only for her own blessing, but for the responsibility of influence. Compassion is training her to hold power without losing tenderness. This alignment with purpose begins to sharpen her choices. She feels a growing discomfort with distractions that once consumed her. Activities that numb her no longer satisfy her for long. She becomes more aware of how she spends her hours, her attention, her emotional energy. There is a sense that her life is converging towards something meaningful, and she does not want to arrive unprepared. This awareness is not pressure, it is invitation. She starts saying no with less guilt and yes with more intention. Each decision feels connected to a larger narrative she is only beginning to understand. Purpose is no longer an abstract dream, but a daily filter. She measures opportunities by alignment instead of excitement alone. As hope, compassion, and purpose intertwine, her identity stabilizes. She is less easily defined by temporary outcomes. Success does not inflate her as quickly, and failure does not erase her as deeply. She begins to understand herself as a work in progress, guided by a steady hand rat. Her than a random series of events. This perspective gives her emotional range without emotional chaos. She can feel deeply without being swallowed by every feeling. There is a growing trust that her life is held within a larger design, That trust does not eliminate fear, but it changes her relationship with it. Fear becomes something she walks with, not something she obeys. Her faith matures in this environment. It shifts from transaction to relationship. She is no longer believing only to receive. She is believing because connection itself has become precious. Prayer feels less like a request list and more like a conversation that reorients her heart. In that intimacy, her expectations evolve. She still desires blessing, but she begins to see blessing as expansion of who she is, not just addition of what she has. The woman she is becoming is part of the promise. Every day she wakes with a subtle sense of being guided, even when the map is incomplete. She senses divine proximity in ordinary moments, a timely word, a sudden calm, an idea that arrives fully formed. These small signals accumulate into confidence that she is not wandering alone. Her steps carry anticipation, not because the path is easy, but because it feels inhabited by meaning, and that meaning pulls her forward with a gentle insistence that something beautiful is approaching. Something that will meet the version of her forged in hope and compassion and purpose. A future that recognizes her growth and answers it in kind, drawing her onward with a promise she can feel more than she can explain. As if her life is leaning toward fulfillment and inviting her to keep moving toward it without needing to see the entire horizon. Trusting the next step enough to take it, and then another, until faith itself becomes the rhythm of how she walks into what is waiting. Another layer of preparation, AP, pairs in the way her patience is redefined. A woman approaching blessing is often placed in seasons where progress is invisible, where effort does not immediately echo back results. She works, prays, improves, and still the landscape looks unchanged. This is where her relationship with time is reshaped. She begins to understand that delay is not empty. It is active. Beneath the surface, roots are spreading in directions she cannot monitor. The waiting stretches her tolerance for uncertainty. At first, it feels like punishment, like being sidelined while others move ahead. Comparison tempts her, whispering that she is behind. But slowly, she recognizes that her timeline is tailored, not generic. The stillness forces her to develop endurance that applause could never teach. In that waiting, her identity detaches from constant achievement. She confronts the fear that if she is not producing visible milestones, she is fading. This fear is exposed so it can be healed. She starts practicing presence instead of performance. Ordinary days become training grounds for gratitude. She learns how to show up fully even when the moment is not monumental. Washing dishes, answering emails, caring for responsibilities that no one celebrates. These acts become sacred because they reveal her character when no spotlight is offered. Consistency without recognition refines her motives. She continues not because she is seen, but because she is committed. That shift builds integrity that success will later rest upon. Her trust deepens in ways that are almost imperceptible at first. She catches herself worrying and then releasing the worry faster than before, not because her problems vanished, but because her confidence in being guided has strengthened. Each time uncertainty rises, she has more history with surviving it. Memory becomes evidence. She recalls past seasons that once felt endless and notices that she is still standing. This remembrance stabilizes her breathing when panic tries to return. She begins to speak to herself with the voice of experience rather than fear. The narrative inside her changes from "what if everything falls apart" to "I have walked through unknowns before." That internal dialogue becomes a shelter she carries everywhere. There is also a refinement in how she handles disappointment. Instead of collapsing into self-blame or blaming the world, she becomes curious. She asks what the moment is shaping rather than why it is happening to her. This curiosity transforms frustration into awareness. She observes her reactions, her triggers, her expectations. Every unmet desire becomes information about her attachments. She learns where she was gripping too tightly and where she can open her hands. Letting go stops feeling like defeat and starts feeling like space making. The absence of what she wanted reveals room for what she actually needs. This reframing softens her resistance to change. As patience grows, so does her capacity for quiet joy. She notices beauty she once rushed past, a conversation that lingers, a moment of laughter that interrupts stress, light falling across a room in a way that feels intentional. These small recognitions anchor her in the present. She is no longer postponing happiness until a major milestone arrives. She is gathering it in fragments. This practice trains her nervous system to rest even while waiting. Peace stops being conditional. It becomes accessible in the middle of unfinished stories. Her relationships evolve under this slower rhythm. She becomes a steadier presence for others because she is no longer chasing urgency in every direction. People feel safer around her calm. She listens longer. She reacts less impulsively. The patience cultivated in private begins to bless her public interactions. She models a pace that contradicts the panic of constant acceleration. Without preaching, she demonstrates that it is possible to move forward without frantic energy. This quiet authority attracts trust. Through all of this, her sense of being accompanied intensifies. Waiting no longer feels like abandonment, but like partnership. She senses guidance not in dramatic signs, but in subtle alignments. Timing that clicks into place, strength arriving exactly when required, doors closing gently instead of slamming. These patterns accumulate into a quiet assurance that her life is coordinated with intention. She starts walking with less desperation and more expectancy. Each day is approached as part of a continuum rather than an isolated test. The future stops feeling like a cliff and starts feeling like a horizon she is already moving toward, step by deliberate step. Carrying patience not as resignation, but as readiness for what is forming just beyond her current sight. A readiness that steadies her hands and clears her vision and teaches her how to inhabit the in-between with a confidence that does not rush the process and does not retreat from it either, but remains willing to stand fully inside the unfolding moment and keep breathing there. Another dimension of her preparation shows up in the way her voice begins to change. A woman nearing blessing often discovers that silence is no longer safe for her spirit. She has spent years minimizing her needs, softening her opinions, shrinking her presence to keep peace. But something shifts. Words that once felt trapped behind her ribs start pressing forward. She feels an unfamiliar courage urging her to speak with clarity. This is not aggression, it is alignment. Her voice is finding its rightful volume. Each time she expresses truth without apology, she feels both terrified and liberated. The fear does not disappear, but it loses authority. She learns that honesty does not destroy her the way she once imagined. This awakening of voice is closely tied to boundaries. She starts recognizing that access to her is a privilege, not an obligation. Where she once said yes out of guilt, she now pauses. That pause is revolutionary. It gives her space to ask whether a request honors her capacity or drains it. Saying no becomes an act of stewardship rather than rejection. She is not closing her heart. She is organizing her energy. People who benefited from her lack of boundaries may resist this change. They may call her selfish or distant. The temptation to return to old patterns is strong because approval is familiar. Yet every time she holds her boundary, her self-respect grows roots. She begins trusting herself to protect her own well-being. With this trust comes a clearer sense of worth. She is no longer negotiating her value based on how useful she is to others. Her identity separates from constant service and attaches to intrinsic dignity. This shift is subtle but seismic. She still gives, but her giving flows from choice rather than compulsion. She helps because she wants to, not because she fears abandonment. The quality of her generosity changes. It becomes cleaner, freer of resentment. She is discovering that love offered without self-erasure is stronger than love purchased through exhaustion. Her decision-making sharpens as her voice strengthens. She becomes less scattered by external opinions. Advice still reaches her, but it no longer overrides her intuition so easily. She weighs input without surrendering authorship of her life. This balance creates a new steadiness. She can collaborate without disappearing. She can listen without dissolving. The center she is forming inside allows her to stand in disagreement without panic. Conflict stops feeling like catastrophe and starts feeling like information. She learns that tension can be navigated without abandoning herself. This growth influences how she occupies physical space. She carries herself differently, often without noticing. Her posture reflects an internal shift from apology to presence. She enters rooms without rehearsing. How small to become. Eye contact lasts longer. Her laughter is less restrained. These external signals mirror an internal permission she has granted herself. Permission to exist fully. The world responds to this energy. Opportunities appear that require visibility. Conversations open where her perspective is requested instead of overlooked. She is not chasing recognition. She is matching the frequency of it. As her voice stabilizes, her fear of judgment begins to loosen its grip. She realizes that criticism is inevitable, but it is not fatal. People misunderstand her and she survives. She disappoints someone and the sky does not fall. These experiences recalibrate her nervous system. What once felt unbearable becomes manageable. She gains tolerance for being seen imperfectly. This tolerance is freedom. It releases creative energy that was previously locked behind perfectionism. She tries new things without needing guarantees. Experimentation becomes part of her rhythm. Through this process, she develops a relationship with courage that is practical rather than dramatic. Courage shows up in emails sent, conversations initiated, choices made without unanimous support. It is woven into ordinary actions. Each small, brave act compounds, building a history she can look back on. That history becomes evidence that she is capable of meeting discomfort and continuing anyway. Her confidence is no longer theoretical, it is experiential. The woman emerging from this season is not louder for the sake of noise. She is clearer for the sake of truth. Her voice carries weight because it is anchored in self-knowledge. She understands her limits and her strengths with equal honesty. This clarity attracts environments that can accommodate her authenticity. She is less interested in fitting everywhere and more committed to belonging where she can remain intact. The blessing approaching. Her life is meeting a woman who knows how to speak, how to protect her energy, how to stand inside her worth without flinching. A woman whose presence is no longer negotiable but grounded, whose words travel from a place of alignment rather than fear, and whose growing comfort with visibility allows her to step forward when called instead of retreating. Trusting that her voice is not an accident, but an instrument being tuned for the life she is stepping into. A life that requires her to be audible, steady, and unhidden as she moves toward it with a confidence that continues to expand each time she chooses expression over silence and truth over shrinking. The final stretch of preparation often reveals itself through a deep restructuring of her relationship with control. A woman nearing blessing starts to recognize how tightly she has been gripping outcomes. She has plans layered on top of plans, backup strategies for every possibility, and anxiety disguised as responsibility. Letting go feels dangerous because control has been her armor, yet life begins presenting situations she cannot manage through effort alone. Doors open that she did not engineer, others close despite her best attempts. She stands in moments where strategy runs out and surrender becomes the only option. At first, this feels like weakness, like standing unprotected in a storm, but slowly she discovers that release is not the same as defeat. This surrender teaches her a new kind of strength, flexibility. Instead of shattering when circumstances shift, she learns to bend. Expectations loosen their rigid edges. She begins approaching plans with intention, but holding them with open hands. This posture reduces the panic that once accompanied change. She still cares deeply, but her emotional survival is no longer tied to one specific outcome. When something unexpected happens, her first response is less likely to be collapse and more likely to be curiosity. She asks what this redirection might contain instead of immediately resisting it. This adaptability is a sign of trust maturing. She is no longer demanding certainty as proof of safety. As control softens, her creativity expands. Energy once spent micromanaging the future becomes available for imagination. She starts seeing possibilities she previously overlooked because they didn't match her original blueprint. New ideas surface in the space where rigid expectations used to live. She experiments more freely, unafraid to pivot. This openness attracts opportunities that require responsiveness rather than perfection. She becomes someone who can collaborate with unfolding events instead of fighting them. Life begins to feel less like a battlefield and more like a conversation she is participating in. There is also a humbling that accompanies this surrender. She confronts the limits of her own foresight. Situations reveal that her perspective, while valuable, is incomplete. This realization does not diminish her, it steadies her. She becomes more willing to seek guidance, to admit uncertainty, to learn in public. Humility replaces the pressure to appear all-knowing. In that humility, she becomes teachable. Growth accelerates because she is no longer defending an image of competence. She is invested in actual development rather than performance. This posture attracts mentors, allies, and wisdom that would have been inaccessible to a closed posture. Her nervous system begins to recalibrate around trust. Where she once lived in constant anticipation of what might go wrong, she starts expecting support to appear, not because life becomes predictable, but because she has gathered evidence of resilience. She remembers crises she survived and solutions that arrived late but on time. These memories rewire her anticipation. She still prepares, but she no longer catastrophizes by default. Calm becomes more familiar. Even in uncertainty, she carries a baseline belief that she will be met with what she needs. This belief does not eliminate stress. It prevents stress from becoming her identity. Relationships shift under this new orientation. She stops trying to control how others perceive her or how quickly they grow. She releases the exhausting project of managing everyone's emotions. This creates cleaner connections. She shows up honestly and allows others to do the same. Some relationships deepen because they can breathe without manipulation. Others fade because they depended on her overextension. She grieves these losses without chasing them. Space opens for healthier dynamics rooted in mutual respect. Through surrender, her faith transitions from negotiation to partnership. She is no longer bargaining for guarantees. She is walking with a willingness to be guided step by step. This walk feels lighter. Decisions still carry weight, but they are not suffocating. She understands that missteps are part of the path, not proof she has been abandoned. Recovery becomes as important as precision. She trusts her capacity to adjust. The woman emerging here is not passive. She is participatory in a different way. She acts with intention while accepting mystery. Her confidence is no longer built on controlling variables, but on navigating. Whatever arrives, this makes her steady in environments that once would have overwhelmed her. She can stand inside unfolding change without scrambling to dominate it. The blessing approaching her life is meeting someone who knows how to receive, not just chase, someone whose open hands are strong enough to hold abundance without clenching around it. Someone who understands that guidance often appears mid-step and that movement itself is an act of faith, and she continues forward with a calm alertness that allows her to respond rather than panic, to collaborate rather than coerce, to trust that what is forming with her is wiser than what she could force on her own. And in that trust, she finds a spaciousness that lets her breathe inside the unknown while still walking directly toward it with steady, willing steps.